Welcome back to the Book Nook listener. It's great to have you with us again. And today we're going deep, really deep into the world of the Berbers.
Yeah,
This is a fascinating group, listener. They're an ancient and resilient people of North Africa.
absolutely.
And you sent us this really, really interesting book, The Berbers, by Michael Brett and Elizabeth Fentress.
Great book.
And you were particularly curious about their culture, like their core beliefs
Mm.
and the role of women in their society.
Right.
So that's our mission today, listener, unpacking those insights from this book and,
Yeah.
just giving you like a really clear and engaging understanding of all those things.
Yeah, I think that's definitely doable.
We'll be tracing their history. We'll look at how they interacted with all these other major civilizations and highlight some of the really unique aspects of their social structure.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. I think you'll enjoy this one, listener.
So let's unpack this.
Well, one of the first things that really strikes you when you start reading this book is how they establish the Berbers' historical weight right from
Yeah.
the beginning.
Right from the get-go.
Yeah, like they quote Ibn Khaldun, putting them right up there alongside these foundational groups, the Arabs, Persians, Greeks, Romans,
Wow.
emphasizing their crucial role in the history of the Maghreb.
Yeah.
Right from the outset, it really reframes how you might think about them, not as some isolated group on the fringes, but like a central thread in this intricate tapestry of Mediterranean history.
Absolutely. And you know what else really caught my eye early on? It was this thing called the Berber Spring in 1980.
Oh, yeah, in Algeria.
Yeah, in Algeria. And it's incredible what sparked it. They canceled a lecture on Berber poetry.
I know, unbelievable.
And it really shows you how vital Berber cultural identity is, even today.
Yeah, it's still there.
And the book also pointed out something that I found really surprising, which is the general lack of awareness about Berber history in the English-speaking world.
Yeah, you don't hear much about it, do you?
You really don't. And there's this anecdote about an American historian who had literally never heard of the Berbers.
Oh, wow.
It's wild,
Yeah.
right? It really makes you think, like, what other significant histories are we missing out on? Because we just don't know about them.
Yeah, it raises this really important point, and I'm glad the book brings this up. It's about the term Berber itself.
Huh.
It's actually not, like an indigenous term. It's of foreign origin.
So,
Yeah. Possibly stemming from the Greek word barbaroi.
oh, interesting.
So that immediately tells you something about how outsiders have viewed them, historically perceived them,
Yeah.
labeled them, often drawing a contrast to their own, identities. And it gets you thinking about who has the power to name and define others.
Right.
And what are the implications of using those externally imposed labels?
I see.
Did the book happen to touch on, if there were like indigenous terms that they used for themselves?
Yeah, it did mention that like different Berber groups throughout history have used various self-designations, often tied to specific tribes or regions.
Makes sense.
So it really underscores that point, that Berber is more of like this umbrella term that's applied from the outside.
Right, right.
Now, getting into like the core of their culture and beliefs,
Yeah.
a really fundamental aspect that the book emphasizes is that for a huge chunk of their history, they were non-literate. Like their traditions, their knowledge, their whole history, it wasn't written down. It was preserved and passed on through oral storytelling,
Wow.
generation after generation. Just imagine how that shapes a culture, where
Yeah.
memory and recitation, the role of the storyteller, it all becomes paramount.
Yeah. And if we connect this to, like the broader sweep of African history, as the book series preface actually points out,
Right.
this reliance on oral tradition is a significant characteristic across many, many parts of the continent.
Mm.
It can contrast to those regions with really long histories of literacy.
Yeah.
And this oral transmission, while incredibly resilient and vital, it also means that the past can be quite fluid at times, adapting to contemporary contexts as these stories are retold and reinterpreted.
Fascinating.
It really makes you think about the different ways that different cultures preserve and transmit their collective memory.
It does. So they did eventually adopt writing. The book talks about that with the Libyan script.
Right.
But even then, it's fascinating how its use often seemed more symbolic and assertive of their identity than purely functional
Interesting.
for things like, administration.
Yeah.
Like, they give this example of Tifinagh being used for love letters,
Wow.
but not for tax records.
Right.
It suggests a whole different value and meaning attached to the written word.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's a great point about the purpose of writing in different societies.
Yeah.
In the Berber context, at least at first, it seems to have been much more about personal expression
Huh.
and affirming cultural identity than, bureaucratic efficiency.
Right.
It's a powerful reminder that even a technology like an alphabet can be adopted and utilized in such diverse ways, depending on the culture.
Absolutely. So with this foundation of oral tradition, and then this, more symbolic use of writing later on, what did their early societies actually look like in terms of organization and leadership?
Well, the book uses archaeological evidence to give us a glimpse into early Berber societies, like the Garamantes.
Okay.
And they seem to have had this warrior aristocracy.
Hmm.
They gained a lot of prominence as the Sahara.
A warrior aristocracy.
Yeah, and this idea of a dominant warrior class.
Yeah.
It pops up again and again throughout Berber history in
Interesting.
different regions. So it seems to be like a recurring theme.
I see. And what about more centralized power structures? Did that develop?
Yeah, it's fascinating how we see that happening. The book talks about the emergence of kings in places like Jerma,
Kings.
yeah, indicating a shift towards hierarchy.
Hmm.
And then we see this pattern repeated among various Berber groups over time,
Okay.
which reminds us that even in societies that are often characterized by this tribal organization and a degree of, egalitarianism, there were still tendencies towards those more consolidated forms of leadership.
I see. So it's not always as clear cut as you might think.
Not at all.
And what about external influences? How did they handle that when other cultures came in?
Well, they were really good at adapting.
Okay.
The book emphasizes that even when significant external influences came into play,
Yeah.
like Hellenistic culture, for instance, with the rise of the Numidian kingdoms,
Right.
core indigenous elements persisted. They didn't just abandon everything. They kind of became bilingual and bicultural,
Wow.
which is amazing.
Yeah.
And figures like Massinissa are presented almost as these super ancestors, embodying this fusion connected to the spirit world
Okay.
and Berber traditions, but also engaging with these Hellenistic powers as equals.
Fascinating. So they were really holding on to their own while also interacting with these new ideas?
Exactly. This blending of cultures is such a crucial aspect of Berber history.
Yeah.
It highlights their ability to absorb and integrate external influences without losing their own distinct identity. And the fact that Berber kings like Massinissa were recognized and engaged with by both the Romans and other Hellenistic rulers as legitimate players really underscores their power and this hybrid nature of their culture.
It's a real balancing act, isn't it?
It is.
Now, let's talk about religion. What does the book say about that?
Well, it explains that the initial official religion of North Africa was the Punic cult of Tanit and Baal Hammon,
Okay.
which had this dualistic nature, reflecting male and female principles.
Interesting.
And it seems to have resonated with the public and private aspects of Berber society. It's a really interesting lens to view their early social organization through.
And then, of course, Islam arrives. How does that change things?
Oh, it's a huge shift. The religious landscape transformed dramatically.
I bet.
But what's fascinating is that while the Berbers did adopt Islam, the book points out a really interesting divergence in religious practices,
Oh,
particularly for women.
okay.
Their religious lives often remain more tied to the private domestic sphere, focusing on things like magic, the veneration of tutelary spirits, ancestor saints.
So quite different then.
Yeah, which contrasted with the more public mosque-centered religious practices of men.
I see. And the book mentions the importance of local sanctuaries specifically for women.
Yes.
What are those like?
They provided this sacred space specifically for women's religious expression.
So they had their own separate spaces.
Right. And the rise of marabouts, or holy men, and their zawiyas, or religious lodges, also became incredibly significant within these Berber communities.
Okay. And who were these marabouts exactly?
Well, they often acted as mediators in disputes. They provided protection. And sometimes they even wielded a lot of political influence locally.
So they weren't just religious figures then. They had a bigger role.
Precisely. The whole development of marabouts and zawiyas illustrates how religious authority in Berber societies was often localized and personalized. It wasn't always about a centralized religious hierarchy coming from above,
Right.
but rather about these influential figures emerging from within the communities themselves.
I see.
And this localized religious power could sometimes even challenge or complement more formal political structures.
Now, the book also delves into the concept of tribalism and social organization. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. So they describe Berber society as often having what's called a segmentary structure.
Segmentary structure.
Yeah, it's characterized by this dynamic of balance and opposition at different levels of kinship.
Okay.
Think of it like a set of nested Russian dolls.
Oh,
Smaller kinship groups forming larger ones,
right.
with the potential for both cooperation and conflict at each level.
Interesting.
It's a system that allows for both internal autonomy and the ability to unite against external threats.
So it's flexible in a way.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is how within this segmentary structure, there's this interplay between a kind of nominal egalitarianism
Okay.
and the existence of internal hierarchies.
So there's still a pecking order.
Yeah, they use the example of the Tuareg with their noble classes.
Right.
Their wealth and status was linked to raiding and controlling trade routes, particularly gold and slaves from the south.
Oh.
So even though there might have been this ideal of equality,
Yeah.
social stratification still existed. And the concept of nif, or public esteem and honor, is also highlighted as really crucial in Berber male society.
Nif.
Yeah, it deeply influenced their behavior and their responses to things like perceived slights.
So reputation was everything.
It was really important. And it's interesting how these social structures are also reflected in their traditional architecture and use of space.
How so?
Well, traditional Berber houses, particularly in regions like the Ores and Kabylia,
Yeah.
often feature this centralized space that's largely considered the domain of women.
Okay.
It really emphasizes that central role of women within the domestic sphere
Yeah.
and their control over the household.
Right.
It's quite a contrast to the layout of traditional Arab houses,
Mm.
where you might see more separation of public and private spaces.
Interesting. And they also had these collective structures, right?
Yes,
They did, like fortified greeneries or wella.
exactly. The book points to those. They weren't just practical spaces for storage, you know.
Right.
They were also really powerful symbols of community cohesion, and sometimes even served as meeting places for men to discuss important matters.
So they really served multiple purposes.
They did. It shows how physical structures can embody and reinforce the social organization and values of a community.
Now, economically speaking, the ideal might have been self-sufficiency at a local level, but the book makes it clear that Berber communities were also actively involved in trade.
Oh, absolutely. They were.
They even had these markets that developed at the territorial boundaries between villages.
Right on the edges.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those tended to be predominantly male spaces for exchange.
Yeah, primarily men would go and trade.
Now, the Tuareg, they really stand out here
Oh, yeah, they do.
with their extensive trading networks spanning the Sahara.
Across the desert.
Yeah, controlling trade in essential things like salt, but also, valuable goods like gold and, sadly, slaves,
Right.
which really impacted their social structure and their interactions with other groups.
For sure. It connected them to much wider economic systems.
Now let's focus on the place of women in Berber society. What kind of insights does the book offer there?
Well, it presents some really intriguing early evidence that suggests there might have been a greater degree of relative equality between men and women in ancient times.
Really?
Like the Saharan rock art, for example.
Okay.
It depicts women in roles that appear to be on a fairly equal footing with men.
Huh.
And there's even one engraving showing a man happily playing with a child,
Wow.
which offers this really fascinating glimpse into potentially different gender dynamics back then.
Makes you wonder how those roles evolved over time.
It really does. It makes you question this idea of like a linear progression of gender roles. You know,
Right.
it highlights the possibility of shifts and changes over centuries, and that historical societies are not static. They change and adapt.
Now, the book also emphasizes this really significant role that women played as guardians of culture and language among the Tuareg.
Oh, yeah.
The transmission and preservation of their folklore and those long, epic poems were largely entrusted to women.
Right.
Which makes sense given what we've already talked about with the importance of oral tradition.
Absolutely.
Women within their sphere played this crucial role in passing down these unwritten histories.
And it's women who are primarily responsible for teaching the Tifinagh script to their children and decorating everyday objects with Tifinagh inscriptions, which often carry symbolic or even magical significance.
Really?
So it underscores this whole private sphere of knowledge and communication
I see.
that's deeply connected to the women's world.
And within the domestic sphere, the book shows women wielding considerable practical authority,
Right.
like the grandmother controlling the storage and distribution of food.
Yeah.
It really shows that even if men held more presumptive power in public life, women still had significant day-to-day control over essential resources within the family.
Absolutely.
Right.
But the book also points out the limitations on women's participation in those more formal public structures.
Yeah.
Like while they might participate in some religious practices,
Right.
their involvement in the official mosque-centered religion, especially after Islam arrived,
Okay.
was often more peripheral, occupying different spaces and forms compared to men. And similarly, formal village meetings and decision-making bodies were typically for men only.
So there were still barriers there.
Definitely. But despite these limitations in the formal political and religious spheres,
Yeah.
the book does note that women were often accorded a degree of respect.
Oh, that's good.
For example, among the Tuareg, women were generally respected during raids.
Okay.
They weren't typically targeted for violence.
And there's also this historical example of the princess who prophesied the rise of the Almoravid dynasty,
Right.
which suggests that they could hold influential positions.
Yeah, even if that influence was indirect.
And the inheritance patterns among the Tuareg are also really revealing.
Oh, they are.
Certain key possessions, like the tent musical instruments,
A marriage bed.
yeah, were symbolically owned by and inherited through women,
That's right.
which points to this significant matrilineal aspect.
Yeah, within their social system.
Yeah.
And the role of female servants and those specific inheritance patterns associated with them
Right.
just further highlight the crucial role women played in the reproduction of labor and social structures.
So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Berbers, there are some really big overarching themes that emerge.
Oh, sure.
One key takeaway is the resilience and adaptability of the Berber people.
Absolutely.
They've managed to persist and hold on to key parts of their identity despite so much change over the centuries.
And another crucial notion is that fascinating interplay between orality and literacy.
Right.
The long reliance on oral traditions to preserve their knowledge and culture.
Yeah.
And then the later adoption of writing, but with those more symbolic uses.
It's a really unique perspective on cultural change.
And how identity is expressed and maintained.
And the book also sheds light on the complex relationship between the Berbers and Islam.
Yeah, it's not a simple story.
Not at all. It was this dynamic process of mixing and adapting,
Yeah.
often leading to these distinct but interconnected spheres of religious practice for men and women.
Absolutely. And it's also crucial to understand the significance of their tribal structures.
Right.
The segmentary nature of Berber society gives us this framework for understanding their political organization,
Yeah.
their methods of conflict resolution, their social cohesion.
It all ties together.
It does. And finally, the enduring importance of place and space really comes through.
That's true.
From the layout of their homes
Right.
to the territorial boundaries of their villages.
Yeah.
Space plays a vital role in reflecting and reinforcing their social structures and cultural values.
So, listener, as our deep dive concludes, I hope this exploration of Berber culture beliefs and the role of women has given you a richer understanding of their history.
It's a fascinating one.
It really is. We've touched on their deep roots, their adaptability, the power of oral tradition, the complexities of their relationship with Islam, and the importance of their tribal organization.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but here's where it gets really interesting. Because
Okay.
while the book provides this rich historical context,
Right.
it also hints at the ongoing evolution of Berber identity in modern North Africa.
Oh, yeah?
These cultural movements and political aspirations that gained momentum with things like the Berber Spring,
Right.
they continue to shape their present and future in really profound ways.
So it's not just a story of the past.
No, it's very much a living history.
So, listener, what stood out to you as the most compelling aspect of Berber culture?
Yeah.
Or the role of women that we discussed? What questions are swirling around in your mind after this exploration?
Maybe you'll be inspired to dive deeper into specific aspects of their history, their contemporary situation.
It's a rich and complex world.
It really is. Thanks for sharing your curiosity with us here in the Book Nook, listener.
We'll see you next time.